Audio of the Enlightenment and Enlightened Despotism, also known as Enlightened Absolutism. Key concept, key concept, key concept. The Enlightenment. It reached its maturation or its peak by 1750. First of all, let's talk about an overview of what the Enlightenment was about. It was a secular worldview that emerged for the first time in human history. It actually is a byproduct of the secularism that actually came about in the Renaissance period. It's an extension on that, though, because it extended to a belief in that natural science and reason could explain all aspects of life. Of course, this is because the scientific revolution, which was also a byproduct of the Renaissance, had occurred. Now they were taking the ideas of natural science and applying them to society. It was also stressing a belief in man's intellect apart from God. Faith in reason, not revelation. Deism was also a big part of the Enlightenment. It was the religious arm of the Enlightenment. Most of the deists believed the existence of God was a rational explanation of the universe and its form. God was a deistic creator, a cosmic clockmaker who created the universe and then stepped back and left it running like a clock, not getting involved on a daily basis. After setting the universe in motion according to natural laws that, of course, we learned about in the scientific revolution, God then stepped back and allowed those natural laws to run the universe. The universe was governed by that natural law rather than by the personal God. This does not discount God. God was still the creator that set the universe in motion according to those natural laws that he created. Some called it the ghost in the machine. The supernatural was not involved in human life. Deism grew out of Newton's theories regarding natural law. And Baruch Spinoza was a philosopher during the scientific revolution whose worldview equated God and nature as one and the same. The principles of the scientific revolution were applied to human society and human institutions, taking science out of the laboratory and instead applying it to society and human interactions and human institutions. Progress with a capital P in society was possible if natural laws and how they apply to society could be understood. Education was seen as a key towards helping society to progress. Key concept. Key concept. Please note, the next few slides on Hobbes are a review from Unit 3 as well, so they are not in your guided notes for Unit 4. But were in Unit 3. We are just reviewing them here for comparison to Locke. Thomas Hobbes, 1588-1679, Leviathan, 1651. His world-renowned book in support of absolutism, but not based on divine right, rather based on necessity, because man's nature was so flawed and selfish. Just to review, he articulated a pessimistic view of human beings in a state of nature. He said that they lived solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short lives. Anarchy results from chaos, and the central drive in every person is power. He stated that political sovereignty is derived, in fact, from the people, but that those people transfer it to the monarchy by an implicit contract in order to maintain law and order and to fend society away from chaos. Once that power was given to the monarch, it could not be taken back. Absolute. He justified absolute monarchy then, but did not advocate the divine right theory of monarchy. It was not because God willed it, it was because it was necessary. His ideas became most closely identified with Voltaire in the 18th century, which we'll talk about later, especially when we talk about enlightened despotism later on in this unit. Hobbes was not very popular in the 17th century, but his ideas would be more popular in the 18th century with enlightened despotism. Hobbes did not favor the divine right of kings, which is what most of the absolute monarchists liked at the time that he was writing. Like Louis XIV in France favored it, James I and Charles I in England as well. Those with constitutional ideas saw Hobbes' ideas as too authoritarian, and that brings us to Locke. Remember the title page from Hobbes' Leviathan, 1651. Okay, so in contrast, let's look at John Locke. John Locke is probably the greatest of all of the Enlightenment thinkers. But if you look at the dates, 1632 to 1704, if we consider the Enlightenment of the 18th century, he dies at the very beginning of the 18th century. So sometimes Locke is referred to as a proto-Enlightenment thinker or proto-Enlightenment philosophe, as they're oftentimes called. His most notable writing was his two treatises on civil government, published in 1690. In this, we see his philosophical defense for the glorious revolution that had taken place in England. Humans in a state of nature, Locke believed that they were basically good, but they lack protection. Very different from what Hobbes had said. They're basically good, but they can become bad because society can cause that because of the lack of protection. This again contrasts Hobbes' view of humans in a state of nature as nasty and brutish. Governments, Locke argued, provided rule of law, but only through the consent of the governed. The purpose of government, Locke said, is to protect the natural rights of the people, their life, their liberty, and their property, the natural rights with which all men are born. He believed also in a social contract, that the people agreed to obey the government in return for protection of their natural rights. This is, again, different than what Hobbes had said. Hobbes had argued, just like Locke, that the power did come from the people. However, he said that once the people gave the power to a monarch, they had no more say in what happened. Locke, however, says that the social contract is that the people agree to obey the government in return for the protection of their natural rights. Therefore, if a monarch ruled without keeping in mind the natural rights of the people, or if he violated those natural rights in any way, the people then had the right to rebel. People have the right to abolish a government that doesn't protect their natural rights. In other words, the contract between the people and the king was two-sided. If the king did not uphold his end of the contract, which was to protect the natural rights of the citizens, then the people no longer had to uphold their side of the contract to obey that government. He also wrote the same year, 1690, an essay concerning human understanding. This is one of the great works of the Enlightenment, and it kind of kickstarts the Enlightenment, if you will. In this, he stressed the importance of the environment on human development. He argued that men were born with a tabula rasa. The human mind was born as a blank slate and registered input from the senses passively throughout one's lifetime. Locke saw all human knowledge as the result of sensory experiences without any preconceived notions. He rejected Descartes' view that all people are born with certain basic ideas and ways of thinking. For progress to occur in society, Locke argued that education was critical in determining one's human development. This, of course, undermined the Christian view that humankind was essentially sinful because of original sin. Key concept. Key concept. The ideal of religious toleration was the second theme that was popularized by many scholars who made the Enlightenment accessible to the public. The first, of course, being those natural rights that Locke spoke of. Bernard de Fontenelle, who died 1757, is one of the earliest. He made highly complicated scientific ideas accessible to a broad audience, first and foremost. And he stressed the idea of progress. He was skeptical of absolute truth, that absolute truth existed, and he questioned claims of organized religion as such. Pierre Bayle is another. He wrote the Critical and Historical Dictionary in 1697. He advocated complete toleration of all ideas. A person should be free to worship any religion or none at all, which was scandalous at the time. He argued that religion and morality were not necessarily linked. He was a skeptic, however. He believed that nothing could be known beyond all doubt. He's similar to Montaigne's earlier views that we talked about back in Unit 1. His major criticism was of Christianity's attempt to impose orthodoxy. Now, the philosophes. They were notable 18th century French philosophers for the most part. Some were not French, but most were. And they were committed to the fundamental reform in society. They were extremely successful in popularizing the Enlightenment, though they were not professional philosophers like Descartes and Locke had been. By 1775, much of Western Europe's educated elite had embraced the Enlightenment, largely because these philosophes had used the power of the press to print pamphlets and essays to get the message out to the reading public. They believed in progress through discovering the natural laws governing nature and human existence, just like natural laws govern the universe, as Newton had said. The philosophes believed that there were natural laws that governed nature and human existence. And if we could figure out what they were, we could make this world a better place and fix the problems in human society. They were radically optimistic about how people should live and govern themselves. Voltaire was one of the most famous of the French philosophes, perhaps the most influential of all of the Enlightenment philosophes. He wrote his criticisms with a sharp sarcasm that ridiculed those with whom he disagreed. He used satire, sarcasm very well. He challenged, for the most part, traditional Catholic theology. He was a big proponent of religious toleration. He had strong deist views, so the more idea of natural religion rather than organized religion. Believed in, the clockmaker view of God, not God that got involved on a daily basis. He believed that prayer and miracles did not really fit in with the ideas of natural laws. He also believed that human reason was the key to progress in society, not religious faith. His social criticism inspired a call for change, setting the stage for the French Revolution later in the century. He hated bigotry and injustice, and he called for religious toleration. He felt that religious ideology, whether Protestant or Catholic, actually promoted bigotry and injustice towards one another. So the best way to get rid of that was to call for religious toleration. Everybody should be able to believe how they want to believe without being criticized for it. His most famous quote against religious intolerance, which he saw in particular the Roman Catholic Church being guilty of, was crush the infamous thing, écrasez l'infâme. Although Voltaire was raised a Christian, he came to distrust organized religion as corrupt in its leadership and for having moved away from the central message of Jesus. That is why he was a deist instead. He advocated enlightened despotism when it came to power structure in society, a more benevolent form of absolutism, believing that people were really incapable of governing themselves, but they did have the right to be governed fairly by the absolute monarch. So he believed in an absolute monarch that would incorporate enlightened principles in their governing. These views were similar to Hobbes' 17th century views, at least while in power, but different on other things. His views ultimately influenced several enlightened despots, including Frederick the Great of Prussia, who invited Voltaire to live in his court in Berlin when Voltaire was in trouble in France. He was in jail a lot in France for speaking out against the divine right idea of absolute monarchy in France, and of course against the Roman Catholic Church. He also kept a correspondence with Catherine the Great of Russia. Joseph II of Austria will also be influenced by his ideas, as well as Napoleon of France, whom we'll talk about in a later unit. Frederick the Great, Catherine, and Joseph II, all we will discuss later on in this lecture. He also believed in equality before the law, but not the equality of the classes. Baron de Montesquieu is another philosophe. He was a French noble who hated the absolutism of Louis XIV, since Louis XIV had done his best to crush the power of the nobility. He wrote a book in 1748 called Spirit of the Laws, where he called for the separation of powers in government into three branches. He believed the monarchy did exist for a reason, an executive branch, if you will. He believed that the nobility had a position in society, and then, of course, the rest of the population did as well. His primary goal was to prevent tyranny and to promote liberty. This separation of powers into three branches of the government, each having its own power and each being able to check the other's power, ultimately will be very influential in new governments that will be formed in the age of revolutions. Of course, in America after the American Revolution and in France after the French Revolution. The principle of checks and balances, it would be called, would ensure that no single branch of the government became too powerful, as the other two branches could check excess power. He favored the British system, actually, of a monarch with a parliament and independent courts. He supported the 13 Parlements in France, those judicial tribunals of nobles, as a check against the tyrannical absolute rule by the monarch that he had seen under Louis XIV and hoped would change now that we were moving into a new era. Montesquieu's ideas had a significant impact, as stated before, on the creation of the U.S. Constitution and on the French Revolution in the 1780s. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is another philosophe. He actually wrote a book named Social Contract, probably taking the phrase from Locke's idea of social contract between a governor and the governed. But he wrote this book in 1762, later, a generation after Locke. He believed ultimately that too much of an emphasis was put on property and not enough consideration of people. He thought this was the root cause of social injustice. Property was valued too much. People were not considered enough, and this caused social injustice in society. He believed in the general will, or a consensus of the majority. He believed that this general will should control the nation. This had strongly implied democracy, but of course it also advocated majority rule. The downside of that, of course, is that the minority viewpoints were not recognized at all. Though these ideas seem to support democracy, the ambiguous nature of what is the general will would later be manipulated by dictators to rationalize extreme nationalism and tyranny. We'll see this take place in the French Revolution's radical phase under the leadership of Robespierre. Robespierre claimed that his ideas were the general will, and therefore they had to be right. Though Rousseau is considered part of the Enlightenment, Rousseau is actually more accurately seen as the founder of the later Romantic movement that we'll cover in a later unit. After the French Revolution, the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason gave way to a glorification of emotion, kind of a backlash, if you will. Many viewed the French Revolution as Enlightenment reason having gone too far. Too much reason caused chaos, if you will, and so the pendulum will swing back the other direction with emotion, emotion, emotion. We'll discuss this more when we get into the later units talking about the French Revolution. Rousseau believed that man in a simpler state of nature was actually better than his modern day equivalent. He believed in what was called the noble savage. And he said that man as a noble savage was better, and that what had happened was he became corrupted by the materialism of civilization. He wrote a book called Emile in 1762. In this book, he supported progressive education. The idea of learning by doing and self-expression was encouraged. However, he argued against equality for women in society and in educational opportunity. So he was progressive in his ideas for men, but not for women, as most of the philosophes were. So please don't feel that when we talk about equality among men, we mean everyone. We mean men. Ironically, he left his 5 illegitimate children in an orphanage instead of educating them. So much for advocating the education and practicing what you preach. Now, Denis Diderot is another philosopher, and he is the one who came up with the notion of the Encyclopedia, completing it in 1765. This would be a multi-volume tome that was perhaps the greatest and most representative work of the philosophes all put together. It was a compendium of political and social critiques from various Enlightenment philosophers and authors collected in one place. It helped to popularize the views of the philosophes ultimately. It emphasized science and reason while criticizing organized religion, intolerance, injustice, and tyranny. With the Encyclopedia, Diderot sought to teach people to think critically and objectively for themselves. The Encyclopedia ultimately, however, would be banned in France. The Pope also had placed it on the index of prohibited books. Another philosophe was the Marquis de Cesare Beccaria. On Crimes and Punishment was his book that he published in 1764. He sought to humanize criminal law based on Enlightenment concepts of reason and equality before the law. He wanted to overhaul the criminal justice system. He believed that punishment for a crime should be based rationally on the damage done to society by that crime. It should not be linked to the religious concept of sin. He opposed the death penalty as a result, except for the serious threats against the state. So for treason that could bring down a state, the death penalty could be imposed. but most of the laws on the books that had the death penalty, Beccaria believed should not. He opposed torture as well to extract confessions, believed that was wrong. His views will influence many of the enlightened despots as well. Frederick the Great of Prussia will ban torture due to Beccaria's influence. Catherine the Great restricted the use of torture, although she didn't ban it completely. And Joseph II in Austria banned torture and the death penalty altogether, but not other harsh punishments. Key concept. Economic theory also came under scrutiny during the Enlightenment period, and new ideas came about. Mercantilist theory and practice were challenged by the new economic ideas espousing free trade and a free market. Francois Quesnay is one of the earliest of these economic philosophes. He led a group that would become known as the physiocrats in France, who opposed mercantilist policies in favor instead of free market. These physiocrats or economic philosophes, sought to reform the existing agrarian system by instituting laissez faire in agriculture. The words laissez faire mean let it be, in the words of Paul McCartney. They believed the French government and the nobility had too much control over land and thus over the economy, which ultimately stifled agricultural production. So the idea of laissez-faire means the government and the nobility should keep their hands off of the economy and allow it to be free. Now, Quesnay was speaking specifically about agricultural production, but others would take it a step farther, talking about all economic aspects. Adam Smith is probably one of the most famous of the physiocrats. He was not French, he was Scottish. His earth shattering book, Economic Theory, called Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. This book is considered the Bible of capitalism. In this book, he refined and expanded the laissez faire philosophy of the physiocrats beyond just agrarian society. Smith believed the economy is governed by the natural laws of supply and demand. So, just like natural laws of gravity and inertia govern the universe, the natural laws of supply and demand should be the only thing that governs the economy, rather than the government putting false dictates on the economy. In a free market economy, Smith argued, competition will encourage producers to manufacture most efficiently in order to sell higher quality, lower cost goods than competitors, so they can outsell their competitors. The government regulation of that only interferes with this natural self-governing style of an economy. Smith referred to this as the invisible hand of the marketplace. The invisible hand is supply and demand. The laws of supply and demand will dictate the price at which society benefits the most. Key concept. Key concept. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about women in the Enlightenment. Women actually played a major role in what was known as the Salon movement. Not that women had equal rights, not by any means at all, but women were the hostesses in the Salon movement. This is for the upper class, not for the regular folk. But many of the brightest minds of the Enlightenment actually assembled in these salons, which is kind of like in a wealthy person's home, their drawing room, their library, and they would come together to discuss major issues of the day. This represented a major example of how new venues in civic society disseminated information to the people in that society. This was a breakaway from the traditional venues of the church or the government or even of universities. Certain French women organized these salons and took part in the discussions themselves if they were allowed to by their husbands or whomever else was there. People such as Madame de Joffrin, Madame de Stael, and Louise de Warens. They were largely organizers and facilitators, however, and were not always treated as equals in the discussions, but oftentimes they were allowed to stay and listen. Madame de Joffrin, however, played a major role in patronizing Diderot's Encyclopedia. She actually got a lot of his funding so he could continue work on that multi volume set. Madame de Stael later brought German Romantic ideas into France in the early 1800s. Key concept: intellectuals such as Rousseau offered new arguments for the exclusion of women from political life, although these views did not go unchallenged. Rousseau was kind of a sexist. He argued that because men and women had different temperaments and different characters, that women should not be educated in the same manner as men. They could not handle the same kind of rigor of study, he argued. He believed that men and women had very different destinies due to their biology. If they were biologically different, then they must be mentally different. He stated that men need women, ultimately biologically, to satisfy their desires, but women needed men for both their desires and their necessities. Therefore, men were far more valuable than women. Many articles in the Encyclopedia, Diderot's Encyclopedia, also emphasize the relative weakness of women or that their lives were frivolous and unconcerned with important issues. Their traditional roles as wives and mothers continued to be emphasized as most important for society to advance and progress. Some philosophes, however, favored increased rights and education for women. The Marquis de Condorcet was the only writer to go so far as to support female suffrage or female voting rights. Montesquieu, in his Persian Letters, published in 1721, supported increased rights for women, but did not believe their family roles should change. So, kind of like today, where women do a lot of things, they have career and family, he kind of advocated that rather than a career, or maybe not a career, studies instead of being a mom, being the woman in charge of the family. In England, a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft promoted political and educational equality for women. She is sometimes seen as Europe's first feminist or the mother of the feminist movement. She argued women should receive similar educational opportunities as men, as they are essential to the nation, for they are the ones that educate their children first. The moms are always the children's first teachers. So, they can be companions to their husbands if they are educated in the same way, rather than just ornaments. She wrote a book called Vindication of the Rights of Women, published it in 1792, where she issued a scathing attack on Rousseau's views regarding women and education. She argued that many, like Rousseau, said that women could not make good political decisions because they were not well educated enough to make those decisions. Her counter argument was, well, then educate them that way and they will make good decisions. There's nothing biologically that would separate them from being able to do that, she argued. Mary Wollstonecraft, by the way, is the mother of Mary Shelley, the author of the Gothic novel Frankenstein, whom we'll talk about later. Olympe de Gouges is another female philosophe, if you will, who wrote an essay, a long essay called The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791. Now, that title may sound weird, but she was actually writing it as a counterpoint or a counter argument to the newly minted Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen, which ultimately was kind of like the French Declaration of Independence at the beginning of the French Revolution. She argued that women should have been included in that declaration. She demanded that French women be given the same rights as French men during the early years of the French Revolution. She was a big supporter of that French Revolution. There were some nobles that supported the revolution, more liberal nobles, if you will. She also wrote in another work that gender equality should be present in marriage. These are very forward thinking ideas that are way ahead of their time. For her criticism, ultimately, of the French revolutionary government not doing enough to advocate the rights of women, she would eventually lose her head in 1793. This is because by this point, Robespierre and the radical phase had taken hold. The reign of terror had taken hold. And Robespierre felt that his will was the general will, and he did not like anybody challenging um, any decisions made by the government, which was him at the time. So, therefore, she was seen as a quote counter revolutionary because she disagreed with him and she was beheaded for it. We'll talk more about that when we get to the French Revolution. Key concept. Later Enlightenment, in the late 18th century, we have I guess you would say, the second wave of the Enlightenment. And philosophers became more and more skeptical during this later phase. Rather than focusing so much on, optimism and progress for the future, we see more skeptics. And in the case of Hume and de Holbach, even atheists' ideas. And they continued, however, to demand religious toleration, even to the point where they thought that people should be able to not advocate religion at all if they wanted to, if they so wished. Baron Paul de Holbach wrote a book called System of Nature, where he argued humans were essentially like machines, completely determined by outside forces. He called this determinism. Those outside forces were the ways of the world, the way society worked, etc. He said that people did not really have free will, that they were completely determined by outside forces. His staunch atheism, determinism, and attacks on Christianity really undermined much of the Enlightenment ideals. David Hume is probably the most popular, most influential of the latter Enlightenment. Um, German. He argued against faith in both natural law and religion, oddly enough. He claimed desire rather than reason was what governed human behavior. As a skeptic, Hume claimed that human ideas were merely the result of sensory experiences. Thus, human reason could not go beyond what was experienced through the senses. He thus undermined the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason with these ideas. The Marquis de Condorcet wrote Progress of the Human Mind, and in this, his utopian ideas also really undermined the legitimacy of Enlightenment ideas. He identified 9 stages of human progress that had already occurred and predicted the 10th stage would bring perfection. Key concept. Rousseau, again, still around at this point because he was later, um, attacked rationalism and civilization as destroying rather than liberating the individual. He influenced the early Romantic movement, as we said before, which comes after the Enlightenment, and he believed in a more loving and personal God than did many of his philosoph contemporaries. So again, stressing that emotion. Immanuel Kant is another German. He's the greatest German philosopher of the Enlightenment. He separated science and morality into separate branches of knowledge, not combining the two together like many of the earlier Enlightenment philosophes had done. He argued that science could describe nature, but it could not provide a guide for morality. He talked about the categorical imperative and said that the categorical imperative was an intuitive instinct placed by God in the human conscience. Yet, both ethical sense and aesthetic appreciation, meaning appreciation of beauty and those kinds of things, in human beings were beyond the knowledge of science, were not something that you could pin down and measure with science. Reason, he argued, is a function of the mind and has no um, content in and of itself. Key concept. Key concept. By the end of the 18th century, religion was viewed increasingly as a private rather than a public concern. By 1800, most governments had extended toleration to Christian minorities, and even in some states, civil equality, at least, to Jews. Classical liberalism is another ism that we'll be talking more about, especially after the Napoleonic era as we enter the 19th century. But classical liberalism is a byproduct of Enlightenment idealism. So that's why we're going to discuss it a little bit here. Classical liberalism constituted the political outgrowth of the Enlightenment. The belief in liberty of the individual and equality before the law was stressed by the classical liberals, but not necessarily full democracy. The natural rights philosophy played a profound role in both the American and French revolutions of the late 18th century. The impact of Locke and Montesquieu was clearly evident in the American Constitution, balance of powers, separation of powers, natural rights of man, um, inalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence, etc. Locke and Montesquieu were also impactful in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, both of which we'll discuss in a later unit with the Atlantic revolutions. Rousseau's idea of the general will influenced the French Revolution after 1791 as it starts to enter a more radical period. The belief in laissez faire capitalism, government keeping its hands off of the economy, letting it be determined by supply and demand, or that invisible hand that Adam Smith had advocated, was also something that was a byproduct of the Enlightenment. The government should not interfere in the economy. That becomes increasingly practiced as we move into the 19th century. Capitalism was seen as the opposite of mercantilism. A belief in progress through reason and education, human dignity, and human happiness were all stressed by classical liberalism in this political offshoot of the Enlightenment. And religious toleration, freedom of speech and the press, just punishment for crimes, and equal treatment before the law were also all stressed by the classical liberals as a byproduct of the Enlightenment ideals. The impact of the Enlightenment on society will be great. It does not happen overnight, but it does happen. The emergence of a secular worldview of the universe for the first time in Western history was embraced by most of society, not just the upper classes like we had seen predominantly in the Renaissance. It had evolved by this point. Enlightened despotism in Prussia, Russia, Austria, and eventually in France under Napoleon will be another byproduct of the Enlightenment on society. We'll talk about all of that later. The American and French revolutions are byproducts of the Enlightenment, obviously, as a result of classical liberalism as well, or classical liberalism in action. Educational reform in various countries will come about over time as we move through the 19th and into the early 20th century. The growth of laissez faire capitalism in the 19th century during the early Industrial Revolution, also, especially in England and in 19th century America, is another byproduct or another impact of the Enlightenment. And new public venues and a print media emerged as well, um, even more widespread than the printing that we had seen during the Renaissance era, reaching more people, spread of ideas. Key concept. Key concept. Audio lecture, Enlightened Despotism, 1740 to 1815. In the 18th century, a number of states in Eastern and Central Europe experimented with enlightened absolutism, also known as enlightened despotism. The philosophes had inspired and supported the reforms of the enlightened despots. They believed absolute rulers should promote the good of the people. Yet, they believed, like Thomas Hobbes earlier, that people were not capable of ruling themselves. Reforms of the enlightened despots were very modest. They provided 1. Religious toleration, 2. Streamlined legal codes, 3. Increased access to education, 4. A reduction or elimination of torture and the death penalty. Let's start by talking about Frederick the Great of Prussia, also known as Frederick II of Prussia. He reigned from 1740 to 1786. The background: he's one of the greatest rulers in German history, first and foremost. He's the son of Frederick William I, who gave him a strong military education. He also was profoundly influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers. He considered French learning to be superior, and he patronized Voltaire personally and invited him to live in his court in Berlin. He was also a musician and a poet, a very cultured guy. The Wars of Frederick the Great. The first 23 years of Frederick's reign were dominated by warfare. The balance of power, diplomacy, and war prevented him from dominating Central Europe and Eastern Europe, however. The War of Austrian Succession is the first war we're going to discuss. It happened between 1740 and 1748. The cause: Frederick invaded and annexed a territory called Silesia. This had been part of the Austrian Habsburg Empire. Frederick, by doing this, violated Austria's Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, whereby the great powers formally recognized Charles VII's daughter, Maria Theresa, would inherit the entire Habsburg Empire. He had secured the Pragmatic Sanction before his death, so his daughter would not be challenged by any other contenders to the Habsburg throne. Prussia efficiently defeated Austria by annexing Silesia. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was the result. Prussia gained Silesia and ultimately doubled Prussia's population in the process. Prussia was now recognized as the most powerful of all the German states and one of Europe's great powers. Here is a map showing the growth of Brandenburg Prussia between 1600 and 1795. This leads us to the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. The cause: Maria Theresa, who was the Empress of Austria, sought to regain Silesia, that territory that had just been taken by Prussia in the previous war. And they gained Russia and France as allies against Prussia. The goal of Austria, Russia, and France was to conquer Prussia and divide up its territories among the winners. This will eventually lead to a diplomatic revolution in 1756, however. France and Austria, who were traditional enemies, were now allies against a Prussia that they both mistrusted. Great Britain, a traditional ally of Russia, however, supported Prussia with money because they felt that they could gain some advantage if they did so through trade and through other diplomatic relations with Prussia. The bloodiest war in Europe since the 30 Years' War in the 17th century was the 7 Years' War. In reality, it was fought on more than just the European continent. It became a world war that also included England and France's struggle for North America. The North American phase of the 7 Years' War is known as the French and Indian War, and we'll talk more about that soon. Prussia was outnumbered by its enemies 15-1 on the battlefield. But remember, Prussia has a very strong military, so they were able to hold their own for quite a while. Prussia, however, ended up suffering too many losses. 180,000 dead and severe disruptions to its society was the result. Berlin, the capital of Prussia, was twice captured and partially destroyed by the Russian troops early on in the war. Prussia was on the verge of a catastrophic defeat when something miraculous happened. Tsar Peter III, who was an admirer of Frederick, ultimately pulled Russia out of the war in 1763. He changed his mind. This saved Prussia from almost certain defeat. Peter was later assassinated, some say because of this switch in alliances. He was actually replaced by his wife, Catherine II, also known as Catherine the Great, which we'll talk more about soon. She actually may have had something to do with his death as well. Again, we'll talk more about her later. Ultimately, the end of the 7 Years' War leads to the Peace Treaty of Paris, 1763. This is the first of the Treaty of Parises that we will discuss in this class. I'm sorry, but there are several treaties of Paris, so it's important to recognize the year to know which war it ended. This is the first one, Treaty of Paris, which ends the 7 Years' War. This will be the most important treaty of the 18th century, and most important since the Treaty of Westphalia from 1648. Prussia permanently retained control of Silesia. France lost all of its North American colonies to Great Britain in the French and Indian War phase of the 7 Years' War. And Britain gained territory in India that France had tried to take away from them earlier. Those are the three continents that this war is fought on: in Europe, in North America, and in India. Ultimately, Great Britain comes out on top. France loses territory, therefore losing some power. Prussia was able to maintain Silesia, but they lost so many men that it will not be a definitive victory for them either. This is sometimes known as the Second 100 Years' War. If you count the wars of Louis XIV, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and then future wars that we will talk about later on in this course, of the American Revolution, the War of the First Coalition, and the Napoleonic Wars. France and England will be traditional rivals in all of these wars. They will not put their differences aside, really, until World War I, when they have a common foe in Germany. The Enlightenment reforms of Frederick the Great, however, do need to be recognized. Frederick saw himself as the, quote, first servant of the state. The destruction of war encouraged Frederick to help improve society. Yet, Frederick was still an absolute ruler, and so he was only willing to do Enlightenment reforms insofar as they benefited the things that he wanted benefited, but did not challenge his absolute authority. His reforms were mostly intended to increase the power of the state, therefore.
The peasantry did not really benefit from any of his reforms, but the military did. He did allow religious freedom, although less so for the Jews, and that was one thing that got him points from Voltaire. Jews finally gained religious freedom in Germany, or in the Germanic territories, in 1794, 8 years after Frederick's death. He did promote education in schools and universities, so he was an advocate of education, much like Diderot had proclaimed. In reality, however, the gains in primary education were very modest. Most of the educational gains were done in universities. He did codify and streamline laws. Being a lawgiver provides order for society. Numerous existing laws throughout Prussia were simplified to create a clear, unified national code of law. The judicial system became more efficient in deciding cases quickly and impartially as well. This would please Montesquieu, as well as Beccaria. Abuses by judges were curtailed as well. He freed the serfs on crown lands in 1763, meaning on the lands owned by the monarchy. Frederick's motive was that peasants were needed for the army. Serfdom remained in full force on noble estates, although Frederick ordered an end to physical punishment of serfs, however, by their lords. He improved the state bureaucracy by requiring examinations for civil servants. In other words, he wanted an educated bureaucracy. He reduced censorship as well. He abolished capital punishment, but not in the army. He encouraged immigration, and he encouraged industrial and agricultural growth. All of these win points with the philosophes, but still he was an absolute ruler. The social structure in Prussia remained heavily stratified, meaning rigid, not a lot of movement. Serfdom on noble lands was maintained. The Junkers, or the Prussian nobility, were the backbone of Prussia's military and the state, so he did not really limit their power like other absolute monarchs would do. Instead, they were his allies. The state did not recognize marriages between nobles and commoners. Nobles were not allowed to sell their lands to non-nobles. The middle class found it extremely difficult to move up socially as a result of these marriage laws. Civilian bureaucrats were not permitted to enter the nobility just because they were bureaucrats. He did not create a nobles of the robe like Louis XIV had done in France, in other words. However, in the judicial system, 2/3 of the judges were actually non-nobles. They were of that middle class. Key concept. Now we're going to talk about Catherine the Great, or Catherine II of Russia. She will reign in Russia as the Tsarina between 1762 and 1798. Background information. She's one of the greatest rulers in European history. As a reformer, she was perhaps the least, however, enlightened of the enlightened despots. She was not even Russian. She was a German princess who became queen after her husband, who was the Russian Tsar, Peter III, was assassinated during the 7 Years' War. She actually took part in the assassination plot. Peter the Great had abolished the succession of hereditary czars. And because of that, that allowed her to eventually take the throne until her son came of age to reign. She was a lover of French culture. She refused to speak German or Russian, only speaking French. She considered herself a child of the Enlightenment. She was very much taken by the ideals of the Enlightenment thinkers, and she read all that she could from those Enlightenment philosophes. Diderot actually came to live in her court for a time. Now, unfortunately, many of her ideas for reform never really came to fruition, only remained on paper. And the result ultimately led to peasant rebellions happening throughout Russia. Probably one of the most famous is the Pugachev Rebellion of 1773. Eugene Pugachev was a Cossack soldier who led a huge serf uprising against Catherine's authority. He demanded an end to serfdom, taxes, and army service, all of which Catherine refused to do with any of the reforms that she was attempting. As a matter of fact, most of her reforms ended up putting the nobility more firmly in the driver's seat by confiscating church lands and selling them to the nobles to pay for her other reforms. Ultimately, this leads the peasants to believe that they are in a worse state because the landowners are more firmly in control, controlling more land. The landlords and officials were murdered all over southwestern Russia by these peasants. Pugachev eventually was captured by the royal forces and executed for treason. Catherine needed support of the nobility and gave them absolute control over the serfs, and this led to widespread bloodshed in the Pugachev Rebellion. Serfdom spread to new areas as a result. The lands that they purchased when she confiscated church lands in places like the Ukraine now became places that serfs would serve their landlords. In 1785, Catherine freed the nobles from taxes and state service. They passed those taxes on to the serfs living on their lands. She confiscated Orthodox church lands, as I mentioned before, and gave them to her favorite officials, her favorite nobles. Nobles reached their height under Catherine's reign, while serfs were worse off. She did import Western culture into Russia, however. She was trying to pick up where Peter the Great had left off with his westernization. Architects, artists, musicians, and writers were invited to Russia by Catherine. Culturally, Russia gained respect of Western European countries. Educational reforms were also put in place. She supported the first private printing presses in Russia. The number of books published annually in Russia increased to about 400 during her reign, compared to a few dozen prior to her reign. That's quite a significant difference. That, of course, is going to increase literacy, but still mostly just among the upper class. A school for noble girls, however, was also founded. Practice of torture was restricted, although not removed completely. Beccaria would be happy with that. A limited degree of religious toleration was allowed. Catherine stopped the government policy of persecuting what were known as old believers, those ultra-conservatives, the dissident sect of the Orthodox Church. Jews were granted civil equality as well. Jews had suffered much persecution in Russia prior to Catherine's reign. Jews could not be nobles, they could not join guilds or hold political offices. They were not allowed to participate in agricultural work or certain trades either. And that was all reversed under Catherine. They were resented by Russian and Ukrainian peasants for charging of interest or usury. Many Jews were in charge of banks because they didn't have hang-ups about charging interest like the Eastern Orthodox Christians did. She allowed strengthened local governments led by elective councils of nobles. This would be the beginnings of what would be local governments, local legislatures. Yet, the crown was not obligated to accept recommendations from these local legislatures, these councils. So, they were pretty much only councils in name. They really didn't have any power. So this shows us some of the shortcomings of Catherine's reforms. Only the state and the nobility really benefited. The rest of the Russian population benefited little, if at all. The nobles gained more legal and financial security from the state. Nobles were freed from taxes or state service. Serfdom became even more severe and entrenched in Russian society. The nobles had complete control over their serfs and could mete out arbitrary punishments to those serfs however they saw fit, even death penalty. Only nobles were allowed to own land. Territorial growth under Catherine the Great was significant, however. She annexed Polish territory under the three partitions with Prussia and Austria in 1772, 1793, and 1795. Poland's government of nobles was ineffective as the liberum veto required unanimous agreement for the government to act. Ultimately, this will lead to Prussia being partitioned by those three states, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. They will lose their sovereignty as a result. Catherine also gained some Ottoman lands in the Crimea that had been controlled by the Tartars. She began a conquest of the Caucasus region as well, the Caucasus Mountain region. This expansion provided Catherine with new lands with which to give the nobility to earn their loyalty. The partitions of Poland between 1772 and 1795 are, as you can see here, which territories went to which nation between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The point being, Poland lost its sovereignty and was carved up among these great powers. Now we're going to move on to Austria in terms of talking about enlightened despots or enlightened absolute monarchs. When we talk about Austria, we actually talk about two rulers. We talk about Maria Theresa as well as her son, Joseph II. In reality, Maria Theresa is not very much an enlightened despot. She doesn't incorporate a lot of enlightenment principles in her reign. But she is important in a discussion of her son, Joseph II, who will be an enlightened despot. Okay, so Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa comes to rule as the Austrian Empress in 1740, and she will remain in power until 1780. The last 10 years or so of her reign, however, she shared power with her son, Joseph II. She was able to assume the Habsburg Empire from her father, Charles VII. This is largely because in 1713, her father issued the Pragmatic Sanction. The Pragmatic Sanction was agreed to by the great powers in Europe that the Habsburg Empire would remain intact under Charles VII's daughter, Maria Theresa. Even though his only living heir was a daughter, he wanted to make sure that she would not be challenged because she was a woman on the throne, that the great powers of Europe would recognize that she was able to inherit the throne outright. Officially, she would be the Archduchess of Austria and the Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, aka the Austrian Empire. She sought to improve the condition of her people through her absolute rule, however. She was a conservative and cautious, unlike her son Joseph II, who was a bold reformer, but brought the empire to near rebellion. The War of Austrian Succession happens almost immediately when she becomes the empress. As a female, Maria Theresa could not assume the title of Holy Roman Emperor, but instead just Empress or Archduchess. The issue cast doubts among the great powers regarding her legitimacy as a ruler of the Habsburg Empire. These were the same great powers that just a couple of decades before signed off on the Pragmatic Sanction to allow her to assume the throne. But once it happened, And once Charles VII was dead, they were pretty much reneging on their deal. Although Maria Theresa lost Silesia, a huge territory, to Prussia during this war, Prussia challenged her and did so by seizing control of Silesia. She was able to save her leadership of the empire ultimately in this war. The Hungarian nobility helped the queen to defeat the Bohemian revolt against her and preserve the empire. She centralized control of the Habsburg Empire as a result of winning the Austrian Succession War. However, she did lose control over Silesia to Prussia. She limited the power of the nobles, reduced the power of the lords over their serfs. She thought that if the serfs remained content, that ultimately that would secure more peace in her empire. Some serfs were even partially freed. Feudal dues by peasants were reduced or even eliminated. Nobles were taxed more heavily. Maria Theresa did more to help the condition of serfs than any ruler in European history up to that time. Only her son, Joseph II, will do more. This was a response to the terrible famine and disease of the 1770s. If she didn't do something, the peasants would revolt, and that would cause division in her empire. So it's not so much that she did these reforms because she cared about the peasants. It was because she wanted to avoid peasant rebellion. She also increased the empire's standing army from 30,000 troops to 100,000 troops, like other absolute rulers throughout Europe. She improved the tax collection system and reduced conflicts between various provinces in the empire. She was trying to create some kind of unity in this polyglot or multi-ethnic empire. She reduced the practice of torture in legal proceedings. She brought the Catholic Church in Austria also under state control, much like the French Bourbon kings had done in France. She sought to reduce the Pope's influence in Austria, but remained Catholic. She suppressed the power of the Jesuits in Austria. She taxed the Catholic Church in Austria as well, and she believed that the church and the nobility were ultimately the foundations of the state, but they were there as foundations for her absolute power. She promoted economic development as well. She hoped that giving serfs some freedoms would make them more productive and ultimately benefit the empire as a whole. She abolished guilds, which hurt the middle class. She abolished internal customs duties, even though that's good for business, it's a mercantilist policy, not a laissez faire policy, not a free economy policy. She encouraged immigration and improved transportation, especially roads and ports, to make trade move more easily throughout the empire. She also supported private enterprise through tax subsidies and tax incentives. This ultimately is another example of mercantilism. Maria Theresa, however, even though all those things sound very enlightened and very open-minded, she is not considered an enlightened despot. She was not a fan of the Enlightenment. She did not go as far as others in allowing religious toleration, which her son will do, Joseph II, along with Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia. She did provide some toleration for Protestants, but none for Jews. Now, her son Joseph II will reign from 1780 to 1790 by himself. He actually was a co-ruler with his mother for the first 10 years or so of his reign as a co-regent until her death in 1780. This was mostly because she did not trust him because he had these wild Enlightenment ideals that she did not trust. Perhaps, though, Joseph II is seen as the greatest of the enlightened despots in terms of reforms, but in many ways, he was among the least effective. Most of his reforms will be undone by his successors. He was deeply influenced by the Enlightenment and its emphasis on reforms. He was a firm believer in absolutism, and he could be ruthless in achieving those goals, however. So, again, enlightened, yes, but still absolute. These absolute monarchs are not willing to let their own absolute power be challenged by any of these reforms that they're putting in place. Now, some of the major reforms of Joseph II. He completely abolished serfdom and feudal dues in 1781 by royal edict, freeing all of the serfs. Ironically, this was opposed by many of the peasants, since the law stated that the obligations to the lords would have to be paid in cash now, rather than in labor. Serfs had little cash available, and so therefore most of them ended up working for the same lords that they had worked for before, but now as sharecroppers. The nobles resisted their reduced power over the peasantry as a result of this. This edict would eventually be rescinded after the death of Joseph II by his brother, Leopold II, who needed the support of the nobles in order to keep his position of power. Freedom of religion and civic rights to Protestants and Jews, however, was issued by Joseph II, and this got him a lot of points from people like Voltaire. He reduced the influence of the Catholic Church as well. He suppressed monasteries, and he also allowed freedom to the press to a significant degree. He reformed the judicial system and sought to make it equal for all citizens. He also abolished torture and ended the death penalty. He expanded state-run schools as well, state-sponsored education. He also will do a lot to improve health care in Austria. He established hospitals, insane asylums, poorhouses, and orphanages. The state provided food and medicine to the poor as a result. The first Medicaid. He made parks and gardens available to the public, and this ultimately will win him some points. He made German, however, the official language of the empire in an effort to assimilate the minorities into the empire. This will meet with some resistance because Austria was a polyglot empire, a multi-ethnic, multi-language empire. Forcing all to speak German will meet with some resistance. It makes people feel as if they are being forced to be someone they're not. And ultimately, they resented it. The empire, even though Joseph wanted to make it better and make it better for the people living there, the empire will ultimately decline in influence and power under Joseph's reign. Austria was defeated several times in wars with the Ottoman Empire during his reign. The Austrian Netherlands revolted against Austrian authority during his reign. Russia was also threatening Austria's interests in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans as well. Eventually, Leopold II, the successor of Joseph II, was forced to reverse many of Joseph's radical reforms in order to maintain effective control over his empire.